The screen is black at first. The only sound is a low, steady roar, like a freight train in the distance. Slowly, it becomes the unmistakable rush of water. Heavy, relentless, alive. In the darkness, faint crackles of emergency radio chatter bleed through. Clipped voices calling for rescue boats, road closures, and medical aid. The camera fades in on a snow-covered main street in a small Catskill mountain town. Streetlights flicker weakly, their glow casting trembling halos onto snowbanks that should have been still and safe. But instead, the snow is breaking apart, carried away by churning muddy water that has swallowed the road. In the distance, the sound of something snapping, maybe a tree, maybe a utility pole, echoes between the steep valley walls. A voice cuts through the scene, calm but tinged with foreboding. January 19, 1996. The Catskill Mountains. Silent giants under a heavy blanket of snow. But tonight, the silence is about to be shattered. The camera cuts sharply to a series of rapid, jarring images. A wooden bridge, twisted and broken, hanging by a few beams as water crashes around it. Cars buried halfway in icy brown floodwater, their roofs barely visible. People waist deep in the freezing torrent, clutching belongings in trash bags, their breath visible in the cold night air. An aerial shot reveals rivers transformed into boiling, chaotic channels of destruction, tearing at their banks as if trying to pull the land itself away. This wasn't just another winter storm. It was something far more dangerous. A perfect storm, born of rare and deadly conditions. Over the past 2 weeks, the region had been buried by 3 massive snowfalls. The blizzard of '96, on January 7th to 8th, dumped over 2 feet across the Catskills and much of New York. As residents dug out, 2 more storms struck on January 10th and January 12th, adding nearly 2 more feet to the snowpack. By mid-January, in some places, more than 45 inches of snow lay on the ground, locked into place by bitter cold. The ground itself was frozen solid, a sheet of ice beneath the snow, unable to absorb a single drop of water. And then, on January 18th, the air turned unnaturally warm. By the next day, temperatures in parts of New York climbed into the mid-60s Fahrenheit, as if spring had arrived overnight. Into this sudden thaw came a deluge. Nearly 5 inches of rain in less than 24 hours in parts of the Catskills. The snowpack, holding the water equivalent of up to 8 inches, began to melt all at once. Millions of gallons of ice-cold water poured off the mountains, down narrow valleys, and into rivers already straining under the rain. It was a chain reaction of nature's forces, snow, heat, and rain converging in a single moment, and it unleashed one of the most devastating floods in New York's modern history. Lives would be lost. Entire streets would vanish beneath water. And for the people who lived in these quiet mountain towns, January 19, 1996 would be a night they would never forget. But how did a peaceful mountain winter transform so quickly into a catastrophe? And why, even at its worst, did the disaster hide a truth that made it even more extraordinary? The answers lie in the hours that followed. The Catskill Mountains rise sharply from the rolling plains of southeastern New York, their ridges and peaks a mix of forested slopes, rocky outcrops, and narrow, winding valleys. To the casual visitor, they appear timeless, almost unshakable, the kind of landscape where winter settles in deeply and stays for months, sealing the land in a blanket of white. But this rugged beauty hides a vulnerability that only becomes apparent when the weather turns against it. The valleys here are steep-sided and V-shaped, carved by ancient glaciers and streams that leave little room for floodwaters to spread out. Thin, glacially derived soils cover much of the mountainsides, and in many places bare bedrock pushes through the earth, leaving nowhere for rain or melting snow to soak in. When water comes here, whether from rain, snowmelt, or both, it has only one place to go: downhill fast into the narrow channels of creeks and rivers. From above, the Catskills are a complex web of watersheds that feed some of New York's most important rivers. To the east, streams like Esopus Creek, Rondout Creek, and Schoharie Creek drain into the Hudson River, winding their way toward New York City and the Atlantic Ocean. To the southwest, the east and west branches of the Delaware River cut through deep valleys before merging at Hancock and flowing toward Pennsylvania and New Jersey. These drainage basins are like funnels. When water pours in from the high ridges, it concentrates quickly in the valleys below, amplifying any surge in flow. For centuries, this has made the Catskills a place where floods can rise with startling speed. The winter of 1996 was already extraordinary before the flood ever began. The first blow came on January 7th to 8th, when a powerful nor'easter roared up the east coast and dumped more than 2 feet of snow across southeastern New York, including the Catskill region. People called it the Blizzard of '96. A storm so intense that highways closed, small towns were cut off, and drifts piled up higher than car roofs. As the winds eased, residents began digging out, thinking the worst of winter might be behind them. But the weather had other plans. On January 10th, another snowstorm swept through, dropping close to a foot of new snow in places. Just 2 days later, on January 12th, yet another system added another heavy coat of white, nearly another foot in parts of the Catskills. By mid-January, the mountains were buried under an astonishing snowpack, as much as 45 inches deep in many areas, and in some parts of eastern New York, more than 50 inches. This was no light, fluffy snow that could melt away harmlessly. Weeks of sub-freezing temperatures had compacted it into a dense, icy layer that locked away a massive amount of water. In some parts of the Catskills, the snow contained up to 8 inches of water equivalent, meaning that if it all melted, it would be like dumping 8 inches of rainfall across the landscape. Beneath this snow, the ground was frozen solid. Every inch of soil was locked in ice, sealing off the Earth's natural ability to absorb water. In effect, the entire region had become one giant, frozen roof, ready to send every drop of water straight into the rivers. Yet, in the small towns scattered through the valleys, life carried on in a kind of winter rhythm. Margaretville, with its neat rows of shops and its bridge over the east branch of the Delaware River, lay quiet under the snow. In Walton, farther downstream on the west branch, the wide main street was lined with banks of plowed snow, and the river flowed calmly between its ice-lined banks. In Schoharie, the historic covered bridge stood silently over the creek, framed by snow-laden trees. People shoveled their sidewalks, kids built forts in front yards, and fishermen drilled holes in frozen ponds, lowering their lines in the hope of pulling up trout through the ice. There was no hint of urgency, no sign that anything was about to change. For those who lived here, the deep snow was a part of life, even welcome in some ways. Ski resorts were enjoying some of their best conditions in years, and snowmobilers crisscrossed the mountain trails. Farmers in the valleys fed livestock from stored hay, their barns warm with the smell of animals and silage. The snow was seen as insurance for the coming spring, promising a steady melt that would fill wells, recharge streams, and feed reservoirs. Few imagined that this snowpack, so picturesque and seemingly harmless, was in fact a ticking time bomb. What no one could see was how little it would take to set it off. A sudden warm wind, a hard rain, and the mountain's icy grip would be broken, sending its entire frozen wealth rushing downhill all at once. The stage was set with almost surgical precision. Steep mountains, narrow valleys, thin soils, frozen ground, and a record snowpack loaded with water. All that was needed was a catalyst to tip the balance, to take the Catskills from serene winter to raging flood. That catalyst was already on its way, riding the jet stream from the south, bringing with it unseasonable warmth and a deluge of rain. When it arrived, it would find these mountains primed for disaster. And when the snow began to release its grip, there would be no stopping what came next. It began quietly enough, the way many winter storms do in the mountains. A shift in the wind, a subtle change in the air. On January 18, 1996, an unusually strong warm front was pushing northward from the mid-Atlantic, riding a powerful low-pressure system that had been gathering moisture over the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. Meteorologists watching the radar saw something they rarely witnessed in January over New York. The temperature lines on their maps were bending north like a great green wave. As the front advanced, it carried with it air more suited for early May than the dead of winter. By the evening of January 18th, the temperature in the Catskill valleys had climbed into the upper 40s, and by dawn the next day, some locations, even far to the north in Messina, were recording readings in the mid-60s Fahrenheit. snowdrifts that had stood solid for weeks began to slump, their crisp edges softening. Then came the rain. It started as a steady patter in the early hours of January 19th, a sound almost foreign in the deep of winter. By mid-morning, the patter had deepened into a drumbeat on rooftops, a steady hiss on the snow. In the Catskills, rainfall gauges began to climb fast. In Claryville, at the headwaters of the Neversink River, the National Weather Service would later measure 4.80 inches of rain from this storm, most of it falling in less than 24 hours. Other towns in the mountain region recorded totals between 4.5 and 4.8 inches. Staggering numbers for any time of year, but especially dangerous now. And this wasn't gentle rain seeping into spring soil. This was water hitting a frozen surface and rushing away instantly. The combination of warmth and rainfall was devastating for the snowpack. 4 days, it had sat quietly under a deep freeze, holding within it the water equivalent of up to 8 inches of liquid. Now, under warm rain, it began to collapse at a rate no one had seen before. Imagine pouring hot water over a block of ice. Channels form quickly, carrying water away in rivulets that merge and accelerate. Across the Catskills, millions upon millions of gallons of water were being released, not over weeks as they might in a normal spring melt, but in hours. By midday, the smaller creeks that fed the Esopus, the Schoharie, and the Delaware branches were running fast and brown, their ice covers cracking under the surge. This was the deadly rain-on-snow effect in its purest and most dangerous form. On its own, heavy rain can swell rivers. On its own, melting snow can do the same. But when the two happen together, especially with the added push of abnormally high temperatures, the result is far greater than the sum of its parts. The rain doesn't just run off the surface. It also penetrates the snowpack, breaking apart its structure and releasing all the stored water inside. The melting accelerates exponentially, and what would have been a manageable runoff event becomes a flood surge. The effect is compounded in frozen ground conditions, where none of the water can sink into the soil. Every drop, from the sky or from the snow, races to the streams. Time-lapse maps created later by hydrologists show the snowpack's water equivalent shrinking almost in real time. On January 16th, broad swaths of the Catskills and Adirondacks still held between 6 and 8 inches of stored water. By January 20th, those numbers had plummeted. Vast areas that had been shaded deep blue for maximum water content were now pale, almost empty. The water wasn't gone. It was hurtling downhill through the valleys, compressed by the steep slopes into powerful, fast-moving currents. In many places, ice and debris added a new layer of danger. As the rivers rose, they lifted the thick sheets of ice that had formed over weeks of deep cold. Those slabs, sometimes several inches thick, were shoved downstream, piling up against bridge pilings and narrow bends. In culverts and at low bridges, they jammed tight, creating sudden dams that caused water to back up rapidly and then break through in violent bursts. Each release sent new waves of water and ice into already swollen channels, battering riverbanks and tearing at roads and structures. By mid-afternoon on January 19th, it was clear to those watching the gauges that something historic was unfolding. The U.S. Geological Survey's streamflow stations across the Catskills recorded discharges climbing to levels never seen before. On Schoharie Creek at Prattsville, on the east branch of the Delaware at Margaretville, and on the Neversink near Claryville, the hydrographs shot upward in steep, alarming spikes. What made it more unnerving was how synchronized the rise was. The rivers across this wide mountain region were swelling together, all driven by the same sudden release of water. From the air, the transformation was startling. What had been a patchwork of white fields and dark forest just a day earlier was now streaked with wide brown rivers, many of them spreading beyond their banks and into roads, yards, and fields. In some valleys, the water spread so quickly that people had no time to react. By the time word spread through emergency radio that evacuation might be needed, the roads out of town were already threatened or underwater. The warm front that had swept in from the south had done more than bring an unseasonable day to the mountains. It had unleashed the stored energy of the entire winter in one violent release. The stage that had been set over weeks of snow and ice was now in motion, and with every passing hour, the waters were climbing higher. What began as the gentle hiss of rain on snow had become the deafening roar of rivers out of control, carrying with them the weight of an entire season. The morning of January 19th began with an unsettling unease, though few could have guessed just how quickly the day would turn. Dawn broke under a low ceiling of cloud, the air warm and damp in a way that felt out of place in the Catskills' midwinter heart. Farmers were among the first to sense something was wrong. In the gray light, they saw the ditches alongside their fields already running with water, the snow on the pasture edges sagging and collapsing in wet slabs. Streams that should have been locked under ice were alive with movement, churning brown and carrying bits of debris. The sound was different, too. A steady, insistent rush rather than the muffled trickle of winter melt. Down in the small towns, shopkeepers noticed it as they opened for the day. In Margaretville, the east branch of the Delaware River ran high and fast beneath the bridge, its surface littered with rafts of broken ice. The water was the color of chocolate milk, thick with silt and gravel, and it seemed to be rising even as people stood to watch it. Across town, the low-lying streets closest to the riverbank were already damp at the edges. By mid-morning, water had begun to pool at the lowest corners of Bridge Street, a slow seep that crept towards storefronts with a quiet inevitability. Up in the hills, road crews were out early, tasked with clearing slush and checking culverts. It didn't take long for them to find trouble. The combination of snowmelt and rain was sending torrents into drainage pipes designed for far smaller flows. At one culvert outside Walton, a thick slab of ice had wedged itself crossways in the mouth, creating a dam. Behind it, water built quickly, spilling over the road in a sheet that carried grit and small stones with it. Crews used chainsaws and heavy bars to try to break the ice loose, but each release only sent more water downstream, where other blockages waited. In some places, small wooden bridges, the kind that had stood for decades, shuddered under the impact of ice floes and logs tumbling against their supports. By 10 a.m., the emergency radio channels were growing busier. The calm chatter of routine winter incidents gave way to clipped updates from highway departments and volunteer fire chiefs. Ice jam on County Route 28A. Water over the road. Bridge at South Street is impassable. Requesting sandbags to main and bridge. The tone was measured but urgent. Each call met with a flurry of replies. Operators began relaying warnings to local officials. Residents in low-lying areas should be ready to move to higher ground. In Margaretville, shopkeepers and residents formed quick lines, passing sandbags to doorways in the hopes of holding back the water inching closer. The cold, damp air inside the shops mixed with the smell of wet cardboard and dust. Outside, the river continued to swell, a steady, implacable rise that made each new mark on a wall or piling obsolete within minutes. The speed of it was disorienting. People who had watched the river rise in past storms were unnerved by how much faster it seemed to be climbing now. In Walton, the west branch of the Delaware was already lapping at the edges of Delaware Street before noon. Ice floes, some the size of cars, spun in the current, grinding against one another before breaking apart. The sound carried through town, a constant cracking like distant gunfire, mingled with the rush of water. Businesses on the riverside of the street began moving stock to higher shelves. The owners of a small grocery store rolled out plastic sheeting across their doorway, sealing it with duct tape in a last-ditch attempt to keep the water out. Farmers downstream took to their barns, moving equipment to lofts and hay to higher stacks, knowing from experience that if the river rose too far, there would be no way to save what was left in the low sheds. Some led their livestock uphill, the animals reluctant to leave familiar ground but driven by the sharp crack of ice breaking in the distance. Through it all, the weather felt wrong. The air was warm enough that breath no longer steamed, and the steady drizzle of rain gave everything a slick sheen. Snow was collapsing into itself, the surface honeycombed with melt channels that carried water down to the streams in thin, darting rivulets. The landscape looked as if it were slowly dissolving. By late morning, the chatter on the emergency frequencies was constant. Road closures were being announced in rapid succession. Reports of basements filling with water came in from 3 different towns. A deputy sheriff in Schoharie County radioed that Schoharie Creek was coming up fast, and that the covered bridge at North Blenheim was already surrounded by floating debris. In some voices you could hear the strain, the awareness that the pace of the rising water was outstripping their ability to respond. What began as small signs, a few inches of water where it didn't belong, a culvert clogged with ice, had in just a few hours shifted into something more menacing. The streams were no longer just high. They were surging. The ice jams were no longer isolated. They were everywhere. And the people in these valleys, many of whom had weathered floods before, were beginning to realize that this day would be different. The river was not waiting for anyone. By the time the clock pushed past noon on January 19th, Margaretville was already fighting for its life. What had begun as a slow creep of water into the lower streets during the morning had turned into a rushing invasion. The east branch of the Delaware River, swollen with rain, snowmelt, and broken ice, burst its banks and poured into the heart of the village. By mid-afternoon, 3/4 of the community lay beneath a churning, debris-filled current. From the air, the neat grid of streets had vanished, replaced by a brown, restless lake dotted with the tops of cars and the peaks of submerged fences. 9 downtown buildings would later be condemned, their foundations scoured or their walls buckled by the force of the water. Even the high school, a fixture for generations, took on damage that would take months to repair. Residents who had lived through floods in the past described the aftermath as like somebody dropped a bomb on their town. The kind of destruction that looked less like nature's work and more like the aftermath of a war. For those trapped inside the village that day, the transformation had been swift and merciless. In one cafe near the river, customers sipped coffee in the late morning as rain pattered against the windows. An hour later, the water was at the curb. Within another hour, it was pushing against the front door. Shop owners and homeowners scrambled to salvage what they could, stacking boxes and furniture on countertops, carrying valuables to upper floors. Outside, the current was strong enough to lift dumpsters from alleys and sweep them down the street. Emergency crews in small boats worked to reach residents stranded in their homes, navigating through what only yesterday had been quiet neighborhoods. Downstream in Walton, the west branch of the Delaware River was staging its own assault. By late afternoon, the river had overrun its banks and was pushing steadily into Delaware Street, the town's main thoroughfare. The rise was rapid. What had been ankle-deep water at 4 o'clock was waist-high by 6, and by nightfall, the street lay under 5 feet of icy, debris-streaked water. Street lamps cast shimmering halos over the flood, reflecting off broken signs and the tops of submerged cars. Business owners had no choice but to abandon their shops, locking doors already half submerged and wading toward higher ground. Then, as if the water itself wasn't enough, disaster struck in the form of fire. During the peak of the flooding, when access to much of the town was impossible, flames erupted in 2 buildings along Delaware Street. Whether sparked by electrical shorts or other flood-related damage, the fire spread quickly, fed by unseen currents of air within the structures. Firefighters were hampered by the sheer impossibility of getting close. Engines couldn't reach the blaze through the flood, and hoses stretched across the current sagged and drifted. The sight was surreal. Buildings burning in the middle of a flood, their orange glow casting long shadows over the churning water. By the time the flames died, both structures were gone. To the northeast, Schoharie Creek was rewriting the local record books. In Breakabeen, the water surged upward by an astonishing 18 feet, cresting around 7:30 p.m. The surge was so intense that even seasoned residents, familiar with the creek's moods, stood in disbelief. At Esperance, farther downstream, the creek climbed 10 feet in just 24 hours, an almost vertical rise for a waterway of its size. Along the banks, farmland disappeared beneath a turbulent expanse, fences and hay bales tumbling away in the current. Hundreds of acres were rendered unusable, their soil scoured or buried under layers of silt and debris. More than 100 farm animals drowned, trapped in barns or paddocks before rescuers could reach them. And yet, through it all, one sentinel stood firm: the historic covered bridge at North Blenheim. Built in the 19th century and cherished as a landmark, The bridge faced the torrent head-on. The water rose around it to a height not seen since the Great Flood of April 1987, marking its wooden frame with a new, higher scar that would be remembered for decades. Locals gathered on the remaining dry ground nearby, watching the structure as if willing it to hold. It did, though the sound of the river battering its supports would not be forgotten. Tragedy was not confined to property and infrastructure. On a remote stretch of Chase Brook Road, near the Cannonsville Reservoir, the power of the water claimed 5 lives in a single harrowing moment. Part of the road, undermined by the surging brook, gave way without warning, leaving a yawning gap where asphalt had been only moments before. A family car, unable to stop in time, plunged into the icy torrent. Witnesses could do nothing but call for help as the vehicle was swept away, the roar of the water drowning out their shouts. Rescue teams arriving later could only confirm the worst. The loss cut deeply through the community, turning an already devastating day into something far more personal and raw. As darkness fell across the Catskills, the sense of siege only deepened. The rain had eased, but the rivers showed no sign of falling. In Margaretville, rescue crews worked under portable floodlights, the beams dancing on the water as they ferried residents to safety. In Walton, the fire's glow had faded, leaving only the sound of water lapping against storefronts and the creak of structures strained by the current. Along Schoharie Creek, the flood roared through the night, carrying with it trees, propane tanks, and the wreckage of outbuildings. The emergency radio crackled continuously. Updates on crests, calls for pumps, reports of power outages and road closures. The people in these valleys had known floods before, but there was a shared understanding now that this one was different. It wasn't just the height of the water, though that alone was staggering. It was the speed, the relentlessness, the way it seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the sky, from the snow, from the ground itself. As the night wore on, the water would finally begin to slow its rise. But the damage had been done. In those long hours between afternoon and midnight, the Catskills had been transformed. Streets had become rivers, rivers had become lakes, and the quiet winter towns had been thrust into a disaster they would be talking about for the rest of their lives. Amid the chaos and the destruction, there was a detail that many in the flooded towns didn't realize at first. A quiet factor working in the background that, in its own way, kept this disaster from becoming something even worse. Far up in the mountains, hidden in deep valleys and behind massive walls of concrete and earth, 3 giants were holding their ground. The Pepacton, Cannonsville, and Neversink reservoirs. These weren't just local water bodies. They were part of New York City's lifeline, part of the vast Catskill Delaware water supply system that sends clean mountain water more than 100 miles to millions of people in the city every day. But on January 19, 1996, they were more than just water sources. They were, in effect, massive safety valves holding back a flood that could have devastated far more communities downstream. The reservoirs were not at full capacity when the storm hit. In fact, coming off the tail end of a multi-year drought earlier in the decade, their levels had been relatively low heading into the winter. This meant that when the rain began and the snowmelt roared down from the surrounding peaks, there was room to store an immense volume of water. Each reservoir acted like a giant basin, capturing the runoff that otherwise would have gone straight into the Delaware River system or the Hudson's tributaries. Instead of a single, overwhelming surge pushing downstream, the reservoirs absorbed much of the initial wave, releasing water more slowly through their controlled outflows. Pepacton Reservoir, impounded by the Downsville Dam on the east branch of the Delaware River, was one of the most critical players. Fed by dozens of mountain streams, it caught a surge of runoff that might otherwise have slammed into towns like Downsville, Hancock, and beyond. Cannonsville Reservoir on the west branch performed the same miracle for Walton and other river towns, swallowing an enormous share of the floodwaters before they could escape downstream. The Neversink Reservoir, serving the Neversink River Basin, cut down the peak flow headed toward the Rondout and ultimately the Hudson River. Together, these 3 impoundments took in billions of gallons over those 2 days, effectively shaving feet off the flood crests in the valleys below. Hydrologists later ran models of what would have happened without the reservoirs in place. The numbers were sobering. Downstream towns already dealing with destructive flooding could have seen water levels 2 to 4 feet higher than they did. Bridges that barely held might have been swept away. Neighborhoods that stayed dry by inches could have been swamped. The strain on smaller dams, levees, and bank protections would have been catastrophic. In some of the tighter valleys, even a 1-foot increase in crest height can mean the difference between water contained and water on the streets. Here, the reservoirs may well have been the dividing line between severe flooding and outright calamity. Of course, the reservoirs didn't make the disaster disappear. In towns upstream or outside their protective influence, the devastation was still total. Margaretville, Walton, Schoharie. These places bore the full brunt because they lay above or beyond the reservoir's control. But for the string of communities downstream, from the Delaware's confluence to smaller hamlets tucked along its path, the storage capacity of those mountain lakes gave precious breathing room. Even in the middle of a once-in-a-generation flood, that extra margin mattered. For many residents, this twist only became clear in the days and weeks after the flood, as engineers, city officials, and hydrologists explained the interplay between the storm, the snowmelt, and the reservoir's role. It was an unusual moment of gratitude for infrastructure that most people rarely thought about except in the context of drinking water. In the quiet after the storm, when the rivers had returned to their banks and the debris was being hauled away, some local officials acknowledged it plainly. Without the Pepacton, Cannonsville, and Neversink catching that surge, the headlines could have been far darker, the loss of life and property far greater. It's a strange thought, that a disaster remembered for its sheer force and speed could have been even more ferocious. But that is the truth of January 1996. The Catskills gave up their snow and their rivers all at once, but the deep, still waters of those reservoirs absorbed part of the blow. They were the silent sentinels in the hills, doing their work without sirens or lights, holding back what they could while the valleys below faced the rest. In a flood defined by its unstoppable rush, these hidden lakes proved that sometimes the greatest acts of protection happen out of sight, where no one is watching. When the waters finally began to recede, the scale of what had happened came into focus, and it was staggering. Across New York State, the January 1996 flood left a footprint that stretched far beyond the Catskills. 41 counties were declared disaster areas, and preliminary damage estimates topped $100 million. The storm and melt had destroyed hundreds of homes and businesses, crippled infrastructure, and carved away pieces of the landscape itself. Roads and bridges were left twisted or simply gone, their abutments ripped out by the force of the current. Farmland that had been productive for generations lay smothered under a thick coat of silt and debris, or scoured so bare that the topsoil itself was gone. For some farmers, it wasn't just the soil that was lost. Livestock, caught in barns or pastures as the flood rose, were drowned or swept away, leaving both an economic and emotional wound. The loss of bridges was felt immediately. In rural valleys where 1 or 2 crossings connect whole communities, their destruction meant detours of many miles or, in some cases, complete isolation until temporary structures could be erected. Emergency crews had to improvise, using 4-wheel drives, boats, or even snowmobiles to move between cut-off neighborhoods. In towns where main streets had gone underwater, the retreating flood left behind inches of foul-smelling mud, a mix of river silt, sewage, oil, and everything else the water had carried with it. Help began to arrive almost as quickly as the rivers fell. Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, teams joined state emergency services to assess the damage and organize relief. National Guard units were deployed to assist in cleanup, distribute supplies, and secure unsafe areas. Local governments scrambled to apply for disaster assistance grants, knowing that the costs of rebuilding were far beyond what any single community could bear alone. State agencies sent engineers to inspect bridges and roads, deciding which could be repaired and which had to be replaced entirely. In agricultural areas, emergency feed and veterinary aid were brought in to keep surviving livestock healthy, while farmers worked to clear fields of tangled fencing, tree limbs, and debris. But as with any disaster, much of the real work of recovery fell to the people who lived there. In Margaretville, shop owners gathered in the shell of what had been the downtown business district. Using shovels, mops, and buckets, They worked side by side to scrape the thick layer of muck from their floors, stacking ruined merchandise in sodden heaps at the curb. Some buildings were deemed too damaged to save, their doors and windows boarded up, but others, even if gutted, would be repaired over the coming months. In Walton, residents formed volunteer crews to move from house to house, helping neighbors clear basements of waterlogged furniture and appliances. The smell of bleach and damp would fill the air as people tried to make their homes safe again. On farms, the work was grueling but necessary. Farmers who had lost machinery to the flood dug tractors and harvesters out of the mud, dismantling them piece by piece to dry and clean the engines in hopes of salvaging something usable. Hay bales that had been soaked and ruined were hauled away and burned to prevent mold from spreading to the rest of the feed supply. Neighbors with extra feed or equipment shared freely, knowing that in an agricultural community, one farmer's loss could ripple outward to affect many others. The resilience of these mountain towns was as much a part of the story as the flood itself. In Schoharie County, volunteers organized makeshift distribution points for clothing, blankets, and food, setting up in schools and fire halls. In smaller hamlets, church congregations cooked meals in bulk, delivering them to families too exhausted to cook for themselves. Children returned to schools that smelled faintly of damp plaster, where lessons sometimes paused so students could help carry in donated supplies for families in need. The road to recovery was long. Some bridges wouldn't be fully rebuilt for more than a year, and many families spent months living in rented apartments or with relatives while their homes were repaired. Insurance claims moved slowly, and disaster aid was often tangled in red tape. But even in the face of delays and frustration, there was a shared determination to put things back the way they were, or, if possible, to make them stronger than before. For those who lived through it, the memories of the days after the flood are just as vivid as those of the flood itself. The sight of neighbors standing knee-deep in mud, passing buckets hand to hand. The sound of generators humming through the night as people worked to pump water from basements. The small but vital acts. Someone lending a pickup truck, a stranger helping to carry soaked furniture, a volunteer showing up unasked with coffee and sandwiches. In the absence of normalcy, these acts became the glue that held the communities together. The January 1996 flood had stripped away roads, bridges, and buildings, but it had also revealed something deeper: the capacity of people to rally for one another when it matters most. And as winter returned to the mountains in the weeks that followed, the rivers froze again, the snow piled high, and the scars of the flood began to blend into the familiar landscape. But for those who had shoveled mud from their floors or carried sandbags through the cold rain, the memory would never fade. The Catskills had shown their fury, and the people who lived there had met it with grit, hard work, and the quiet promise that they would rebuild together. In the years that followed, the January 1996 flood left more than just physical scars on the towns and valleys of New York. It reshaped how communities thought about, prepared for, and responded to flooding. Local leaders, emergency managers, and residents all recognized that this was not just another bad winter storm. It was a convergence of rare factors: deep snowpack, sudden warmth, heavy rain, and frozen ground that demanded a different kind of vigilance. That awareness would change emergency planning in the Catskills and across the state. One of the most significant shifts came in how floods were monitored and predicted. Before 1996, the region relied heavily on stream gauges, weather forecasts, and historical patterns to anticipate high water. But the speed and ferocity of this flood made it clear that rain-on-snow events, especially in mountainous regions with frozen ground, could cause rivers to rise far faster than standard models predicted. In response, state agencies invested in better real-time monitoring, expanding the U.S. Geological Survey's network of streamflow gauges, improving data sharing between meteorologists and local emergency managers, and integrating snowpack measurements into flood forecasting models. Hydrologists began tracking the snow water equivalent more closely, so they could estimate how much water a sudden thaw might unleash. Ice jams, a major factor in the 1996 disaster, also became a focus. Many towns developed plans to monitor and break up jams before they became dangerous, using excavators, cranes, or even controlled blasting in some cases. Bridges and culverts were inspected with new urgency, and some older structures were replaced or modified to better withstand the battering of ice and debris. In certain choke points along rivers, engineers redesigned spans to allow larger volumes of water and ice to pass through without damming up. Perhaps the most important legacy was public awareness. Before 1996, rain on snow might have sounded like a harmless phrase, even to those living in flood-prone areas. Afterward, it became a warning that people took seriously. Local radio stations, newspapers, and community bulletins began explaining the risks in plain language whenever warm rains were forecast over snow-covered ground. Residents learned to watch for the early signs: streams turning brown and fast, ice starting to shift, water pooling in low spots. Emergency drills and evacuation plans were updated, and many families began keeping go bags with essentials ready in case they had to leave at short notice. For all the technical and procedural changes, the most enduring memory for many was sensory. Ask someone who lived through the flood and they will tell you about the sound. It wasn't just the rush of water, though that alone was loud enough to carry for miles. It was the sharp, irregular cracks of ice breaking free, the deep thuds as slabs collided or slammed into bridge pilings, the rattling clatter of trees and debris tumbling in the current. It was the sound of a landscape in motion, a river not just flowing but tearing itself apart and carrying everything in its path. That sound is part of why the 1996 flood still holds a place in the collective memory of these mountain towns. It was a reminder that winter's stillness can be deceptive, that in the right or wrong combination of conditions, the quietest season can turn violent in a matter of hours. And it reinforced a truth the people of the Catskills have always known: the rivers that give life to these valleys can also take it away. Today, as weather patterns grow less predictable and extreme events become more common, the lessons of January 1996 remain relevant. The investments in monitoring, the attention to ice jam mitigation, and the understanding of rain-on-snow dynamics are all part of the region's resilience. But perhaps just as important is the shared memory, a living reminder carried in stories, photographs, and the echo of that sound, the mix of rushing water and snapping ice, that marked the night the Catskills flooded. Snow falls in slow, lazy spirals, drifting down to rest on the bare branches of maples and the dark green boughs of hemlock. The rivers, now back within their banks, move quietly under a thin crust of ice. Main streets that once lay beneath churning brown water are lined again with parked cars, their roofs powdered white. The sound is different now. No roar, no crack, just the faint hiss of snow settling on rooftops and the muffled crunch of footsteps on a frozen sidewalk. The scars of the flood are still here if you know where to look. A missing bridge replaced by steel and concrete where wood once stood. A high water mark faintly visible on the side of a building, just above the second-story window. A stretch of farmland still bare where the topsoil was stripped away. But the hills themselves stand as they always have, patient and still, draped in winter's quiet. In a clearing, a farmer pauses by a fence line, watching flakes swirl in the wind. Down in the village, the lights in shop windows glow warm against the gray afternoon, a reminder that life here goes on, season after season, storm after storm. Children pull sleds up the same hills where, not long ago, water ran in torrents. The people of these valleys know the river's moods, and they carry the memory of the night it rose higher than anyone thought possible. The camera lifts, rising above the snowbound rooftops, over the frozen rivers and the winding roads that thread between the mountains. The Catskills stretch away in every direction, their peaks softened by snow, their valleys deep and hidden. From above, it is impossible to tell which creeks once raged, which streets once vanished beneath the flood. The narrator's voice returns, calm and measured. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes in one warm night, they let it all go.